the Chinese security forces not to hurt the protesting monks. On the same day, monks from the Rigzum monastery and lay Tibetans from the Katsi Autonomous Prefecture participated in peaceful demonstrations against the Chinese government. The response from the Chinese security forces was harsh. They fired on the protesters, killing 3 and injuring 10. 170 protesters were also arrested, of whom only 10 were released. That day, more than 100 nuns marched in protest from their nunnery Chusang to the Pako area in Lhasa. They were, however, stopped in their tracks by the Chinese security forces. Undeterred, the nuns resumed their protest 2 days later on 13th March. This prompted the Chinese authorities to convene a meeting which decided to issue strict orders to prevent the Tibetans from visiting Lhasa. Foreigners were also banned from entering Tibet. On 14th March, the Chinese security forces surrounded the Ramuche monastery and the Tsuklakang, preventing the Tibetans from visiting these sacred Buddhist shrines. They also ordered the monks to close the doors of the monasteries. As a result, around 100 monks from Gyute Monastery came out into the streets to protest against the arrests and beatings the previous day of monks and nuns from Drebung and Sera monasteries who had done nothing but protested peacefully. However, the Chinese police and its vehicles were right there at the gate of the Gyute Monastery to prevent the monks from leaving. Chinese police in civilian clothes also infiltrated the Tibetan populace and blocked the main road from Ramuche Monastery to Tomsikang and Pakor, as these were the areas in which most of the Tibetans reside. Many young and elderly Tibetans were also assembled near the gate of Gyute Monastery. They saw the Chinese security forces who were at the gate of Ramuche Monastery using force to prevent the monks from leaving their compound. Around 11 a.m., the Chinese security forces verbally and physically abused and threatened the monks and lay Tibetans who have been prevented from marching on. They apparently used electronic batons on some of the monks, inflicting severe injuries on them. This triggered a strong response from the Tibetans when tensions were high and patience had worn thin. The distressing excesses continually committed by the Chinese security forces for the previous few days were wearing everyone out. The police vehicles bore the brunt of Tibetan anger. The police vehicles were turned upside down by the Tibetan bystanders. The monks then demonstrated by raising slogans speaking against the Chinese. They were joined by other lay Tibetans, increasing the intensity of the protest. Then the demonstrations went out of control as more than 1,000 Tibetans joined in. Tibetans and Chinese security forces started throwing stones at each other. A few Tibetan protesters ran towards the Chinese shops, smashing and setting them on fire. Instead of stopping them, the Chinese security forces stood around watching the violence and expressions of frustration. As Somo, a Tibetan lady who arrived recently from Tibet, remembers.
I was not a witness to the actual incident that morning, but I heard people saying that a monk from Gyute had an altercation with Chinese security forces. The monk was hit over the head by the security forces. Some of them said the monk received severe injuries to his head, while others claimed that his eyeballs were crushed. As blood came from the monk's eyes, the rest of the Tibetans present became incensed and rose up against the Chinese. I myself then saw Chinese security forces moving in. I saw at least 30 police military vehicles.
Kunsang Sodam also said that all access to the 3 great monasteries of Tibet, Sera, Drebung and Ganden, had been blocked by the Chinese security forces on 12 March 2008. He said,
Monasteries are surrounded by the Chinese military. We can't enter inside and monks are not allowed to come outside. They can neither make calls and nor can they receive calls. The phone lines are disconnected. We have also heard that they are not provided water since few days back and foods are also deprived.
The Chinese security forces failed to stop the protesters from marching ahead as they arrived on the road leading to the Lhasa Meteorological Office, where armored vehicles and Chinese police in full riot control gear were waiting. Chinese police's response was swift. They fired indiscriminately on the protesters from their secure positions inside the armored vehicles. Kunsang Sonam says,
Later, many Chinese soldiers arrived. 3 armored personnel carriers also arrived there. They said many such armored carriers were deployed in and around Lhasa. The Chinese security forces indiscriminately fired tear gas on the Tibetans. I tried to avoid the tear gas by lying myself down. The Chinese were firing shots from within the armored personnel carriers, which were followed by around 30 to 40 Chinese soldiers. Many Tibetans fell to the ground after they were shot at. The Chinese forces picked them up and carried away. I couldn't tell whether the Tibetans who fell down were dead or still alive. I couldn't tell where they being carried away. I witnessed 4 Tibetans being carried away by the Chinese. I couldn't identify those 4 Tibetans as I was hiding for my life.
The Chinese security forces started arresting monks from Drebung and Sera and other Tibetans in Lhasa from March 10. They stepped up their campaigns of arrest and torture from the 17th of March. Police were deployed in the streets and boulevards of Lhasa, patrolling 24 hours a day. Only Chinese and foreigners, but no Tibetans, were allowed to leave their homes and go out into the streets of Lhasa. As a result, many Tibetans suffered severe hardships. Some were even denied basic necessities such as tsampa and water, soon reducing them to a state of near starvation. The police made door-to-door searches of Tibetan households, and anyone walking on the streets of Lhasa were randomly questioned and asked to show their resident permits. Tibetans who failed to show their resident permits were arrested, beaten severely, and put into prisons. In fact, the Chinese made so many arrests that they actually ran out of handcuffs and had to substitute them with iron strings to tie the hands of arrested Tibetans. In his web blog on 11 April, Tenzin Tsepak wrote, "In some areas, Tibetans possessing resident permits were not permitted by the Chinese security forces to move. I heard that the Chinese made door-to-door searches of Tibetan households, in the process arresting more than 1,000 Tibetans. The Chinese security forces were running out of handcuffs and they had to substitute iron strings to handcuff the Tibetans." The Chinese also tortured the Tibetans, according to some eyewitnesses' accounts. It is said that one 17-year-old Tibetan youth lost consciousness after he was severely beaten by the Chinese security forces. The boy was lifted up and thrown into the air a few times. He died after falling heavily to the ground. Some of the Chinese security forces went to a Tibetan village where they started abusing the Tibetans there who did not speak a word of Chinese. A Tibetan policeman tried to intervene by persuading the Chinese security forces not to abuse the villagers. Rather than listening to him, the Chinese security forces hit the Tibetan policeman on his face with an electric baton. Several of his teeth were broken and blood was oozing out of his mouth. He fell to the ground unconscious. The Chinese also assaulted Tibetan school children who were on the way to their schools. Tibetan girls in particular were the targets of Chinese police abuse as they were ordered to remove their clothes, enabling the police to carry out a thorough check of their bodies, causing great distress. Most of the Chinese security forces were from Sichuan province. They don't speak a word of Tibetan and forced Tibetan cadres to serve as translators. They even issued stern warnings that those who failed to show up as translators as directed would be dismissed from their jobs. The people of Lhasa city were living in constant fear and terror as the Chinese security forces stepped up their campaign to raid their households and made random arrests at night and tortured the prisoners. A Tibetan cadre from China who wished to remain anonymous made a phone call in which he said,
"Because of strict Chinese control in Lhasa, many Tibetans suffered severe hardship. They were denied basic food supplies like samba. On top of this, the Chinese meat and vegetable vendors doubled the price of their products. When the Tibetans asked the Chinese vendors why there was an unexplained doubling of prices of meat and vegetables, the Chinese security forces arrested them and took them to prison. This was unnecessary and uncalled for. Subsequently, if an altercation broke out between Tibetans and Chinese, the Tibetans had no choice but to run away. The Chinese security forces made arrests solely based on ethnic and political lines. They don't even need the excuse of resident permits. The Chinese language itself is the resident permit."
He even claimed the Tibetans serving in the security forces were also randomly beaten up by the Chinese.
"Yesterday I was on the road driving my car. I saw a Chinese car driver violating the traffic signal by crossing the red light. A traffic policeman who happened to be Tibetan tried to stop the Chinese driver. As soon as the Chinese recognized the traffic policeman to be Tibetan, he raised his hand and struck him. Some Chinese have become very arrogant now and indicate they rule the roost in Lhasa."
When the demonstrations broke out, the Chinese government forced all foreign journalists, including those from Hong Kong, to immediately leave Tibet. The tourists in Tibet were also kept in detention. Their pictures and photographs of the demonstrations were confiscated by the police. The Chinese security forces then arrested around 1,000 Tibetans, regardless of whether they had actually participated in the demonstrations or not. During a press conference in Beijing, which was broadcasted on Xisang TV, Champa Phuntsok, governor of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, admitted to having arrested 653 Tibetans who were accused of participating in the demonstrations. The Chinese state media claimed that 10 Chinese people died in the demonstrations. It did not mention anything at all about the Tibetan deaths. However, according to information received from Tibet, between 1 and 300 Tibetans died in the demonstrations. The bodies of the dead Tibetans were hauled into a military truck and carried to Tulung, situated to the west of Lhasa, where they were burned by the Chinese security forces, leaving no trace or evidence. Tsomo, who was a witness to this, says,
"I heard gunshots in the street of Lhasa on 15th, 16th and 17th March. One of the 9 Tibetans killed in Lhasa's Lupuk area was Lakpa Tsirik, who was on friendly terms with someone I know. It is said that the victim, Lakpa Tsirik, is survived by his 2-year-old daughter. He was a resident of Tulung and made his living by driving taxis for tourists. He died on Friday after he was shot on his head. His body was said to be cremated 2 days later on the Monday. However, agents from Public Security Bureau ordered the Tibetans to hand over the body, saying that since he was shot on his head, they needed the body for routine post-mortem check. Later, the Chinese set fire to the body near Tulung district on Wednesday, gave the ashes and remains of the burned body to Tibetans and told them to conduct whatever ritual prayers they deem necessary for the victim.
On 3rd April 2008, the Chinese official website China News released a story in which Lakpa Tsirik, whose body was burned by the Chinese, was surprisingly listed as one of the 18 people killed by the Tibetans in what the Chinese call as 3.14 Lhasa riots. The Chinese, by this action, was thus able to conceal the truth from the international community. Responding to reporters during a press conference, Champa Phuntsok, Deputy Party Secretary of Tibet, said, "The People's Liberation Army was not involved in suppressing the Lhasa riots. Members of the Public Security Bureau and the People's Armed Police have not used offensive weapons to bring the riot under control. Not a single shot was fired." He amazingly then claimed that the armored personnel carriers and the Chinese police in full riot control gear were deployed to clean the streets of Lhasa. Champa Pinsok said, "Such cleanliness drives has always been the tradition of the PLA, further distorting the truth of PLA's violent crackdown on the Tibetan people." A Tibetan from China who wishes to remain anonymous made a phone call to India after visiting Tibet. He said,
"The Chinese government deployed more than 10,000 soldiers in and around Lhasa, ordering them to get ready for war. The orders were issued because of the urgent nature of the situation. The Chinese soldiers were aiming rifles on the Tibetans. This was not just to strike fear and terror into the hearts of the Tibetans. This was something that quickly became a reality. For the first time in our lives, we experienced such fear and terror. In the past, the Chinese used to show us propaganda films about the massacre of innocent Chinese in Nanjing by the Japanese army. Now the Chinese are doing to us exactly what the Japanese did to them."
During the session of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, Tang Jingling, party secretary of the Tibet Autonomous Region, said, "In terms of economic and social development, Tibet has reached its greatest height in its entire history. Tibetans regard the Communist Party as the savior, like Lord Buddha. Apart from a few separatists, the majority of the Tibetan people are living a life of joy and happiness under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party." Khuensang Sonam, however, claims that one of the reasons why the Tibetans demonstrated against the Chinese rule was the fact that Tibet is flooded by Chinese immigrants and that the life of Tibetans has deteriorated as never before. He said,
Now, the reason why did we protest against the Chinese government? The Chinese government claims to have given the Tibetans freedom of religion. If that is true, then we are free to worship and practice. But the fact is that the Chinese government places restrictions on Tibetans who wanted to become monks and join the monastery. That is a clear violation of religious rights. Secondly, we are not allowed to keep the picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is living in exile in India. The Chinese confiscate all the protests of His Holiness. They trample upon the protests of His Holiness and levy fines on Tibetans who defy this ban. The Chinese also arrest and torture us in prison if we were caught keeping the protests of His Holiness. Further, the Chinese government owns us as slaves instead of regarding us as human beings. For instance, nomads have to pay taxes every year. If they own animals, they have to pay extra taxes in the form of animal products. The grass and water that is consumed by animals are also taxed by the Chinese states. The same is the case with farmers who are levied exorbitant taxes. Thus, we suffer a lot under the Chinese and had no choice but to rise up against their harsh treatment.
An analysis of comments made by people who witnessed the demonstrations in Tibet and also of the statements issued by the Chinese government regarding what it refers to as the 3.14 Lhasa riots aimed at destroying social institutions enables us to reach the following conclusion. The recent peaceful demonstration in Tibet was a manifestation of Tibetan people's deep resentment and anger against years of Chinese government's intolerable repression. As the demonstrations coincided with the second session of the National People's Congress in Beijing, the Chinese government's lies and propaganda regarding Tibet were exposed, causing enormous embarrassment to the PRC leaders. Since the Chinese government was not in a position to immediately suppress the protesters, it used lie and deception to change the nature of the protest. Agents of Chinese Secret Service and police, disguised as Tibetans, were sent in to join the demonstrations. They reportedly then went on to smashing and burning the Chinese shops, even stabbing the passers-by. After changing the nature of the peaceful demonstration into what it calls as riots aimed at destroying social stability, the Chinese secured the modicum of legitimacy it needed to brutally suppress the Tibetan protesters. All of the reported incidents clearly show that this drama was scripted by the Chinese government. China was the leading protagonist as it filmed the demonstrations, made a video, and distributed it internationally. This was even corroborated in writings by Chinese authors like Wang Linshun, Ten Baokong, and Hu Ping, who have had actual experience in dealing with other such deceptions by the Chinese government. In the past, the Chinese government had never given compensation to people who had suffered losses in the demonstrations. This time, however, out of self-embarrassment, the relevant officers of the Tibet Autonomous Region, as ordered by the regional CCP, made an announcement on 30th March to give an amount of yuan 200,000 as compensation to the victims of families who died in what the Chinese refer to as 3.14 Lhasa riots. Further announcement was also made to give compensation by the Public Security Bureau to 16 victims after their bodies were identified by their families. The Chinese government accused the Tibetan separatists of wielding knives. They said that one Tibetan cut off the ears of a Chinese by using a knife. Ironically, when the very same Chinese victim came to receive his compensations from the Chinese authorities, his ears were not missing. This misleading information released by the Chinese government itself proves that many deaths of the so-called 3.14 Lhasa riots was completely scripted by them. Almost 2 weeks after suppressing the demonstrations in Lhasa, the Chinese government invited 30 selected foreign journalists from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other countries to visit Tibet. On 27 March 2008, these journalists were taken on a stage-managed tour of Lhasa's